What's the next best thing?
Next on Eternal Durdles.
This episode is supported by our Durdle Maniacs, who enjoy ad-free content as well as bonus content that can be found either on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. If you're thinking about supporting the show, we'd really appreciate it, and you can find us on any of those mediums. What it do? Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, do you think if Sensei's Divining Top was in the format that people wouldn't be so disenchanted by it? I do.
Oh, well, you can't disenchant Sensei's Divining Top because you can just have put it back on top of your deck, is my answer.
Yeah, that's why if they made Magus as the Sensei's top, then it wouldn't be a problem.
Well, you couldn't disenchant that either, probably.
Well, if it's an artifact creature, you could. The design space is open. That's all I'm saying. The design space is open.
True. So I want to frame this episode in two ways, right? So one, we want to talk about like what our speculation is when in August when they announced the BNR. But before we get into that and talk about like what decks should we be prepared to play against and that sort of thing, you just told me about sort of a piece of legacy news that I think sort of exacerbates the issue we're already talking about. So tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, so in the next couple of weeks, there are a couple of different 5Ks that I think people were planning on playing, monthly events like, at the locals or whatever. And obviously everybody was expecting a Greek ban, and this last ban and restricted announcement that didn't come. And so people were unsure of are players going to show up for these events? Are they just going to take some time off during the summer until they do what is inevitable at this point, right? So how would the player base respond to not getting the news that they wanted and expected, and then the addition of the news hearing that WotC had whoever their legacy expert is, say that they should make a move, and then they were like, we're just not going to do that, so they didn't listen to their legacy expert. And I think that, whoever that is, and whatever that looks like, we don't actually know, we know none of the details, but some story leaked to that, like they didn't listen to their expert when the expert told them what everybody was feeling anyway.
Oh, it wasn't a leak, Phil. This was on the weekly MTG, like with Blake Rasmussen.
Yeah,
this happened.
I'm happy you cleared that up
in real time.
So it happened in real time. I'm happy you cleared that up because that seemed to have also exacerbated the problem, right? People were like,
"Yeah, of course." People were upset,
of course. But because of that, it seems that now players are responding in ways. Players are responding in ways that are significant enough that TOs and shops are now responding. And when I say TO and shops, I mean one specific example, which today, as we're recording, Owl City, which is a shop in Pennsylvania, they were hosting a 5K in the next couple of weeks, I think on the 20th of July. And, if you're anywhere in the Northeast, within reasonable driving
5K
distance.
is good.
Yeah, for a reasonable driving distance, I mean.
That's a SCG event.
We're literally going to Baltimore because there's a 5K, right? So that's a long enough distance that it's like if you would go to if you are where we are in New York and Philly and we're willing to go to Baltimore, then we'd be willing to go to Pennsylvania for a 5K, right? Sure, that's not out of the question that you get that kind of reach for a 5K. They just announced that they aren't doing the 5K. They're canceling the 5K because they don't think that the experience that they want a 5K to have with the format will be one that will be positive and enjoyable for people.
It's just going to be people griping the entire time that they're getting beat by grief. And so, that's not a fun experience for anybody, especially a TO.
Not a fun experience for anybody, specifically the TO, right?
Yeah.
So instead of that, they canceled the 5K and are just doing the regular monthly event that they would normally do for however much that is worth. But I think that's I'd be interested to see now if other shops follow suit. Will this be the first one where we only get these sort of smaller tournaments or the more significant higher stakes tournaments? It's not crazy high stakes or anything, right? But there's win a duel event type things. Do those change? Is there going to be something until the ban happens? Are they going to ban Nadu and Modern and we talked about, and then in an emergency announcement, and then do the same for Legacy rather than let these formats dwindle for summer when people would otherwise be getting some games in? So I don't know, but
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned. It's funny that we're in this state right now where we're in this limbo, right? And not to get too far into the political debate or whatnot, but that is the current status of, you know, like one of the two parties in America is like, what's this guy going to do? Is he going to drop out? Is he going to, you know, like they're waiting for an emergency decision, right? And it's sort of funny in the most morbid possible way. Is it sort of funny that like we're living in sort of parallel universes where we're in this like weird lame duck period of magic, but we're also in this weird lame duck period of like the political cycle where like people are like, well, what do we do? What, you know, like what's the next thing to do? And a lot of the commentary is like, well, if that happens, then the VP takes over. But who's that VP going to be? And so like that's where like, you know, for us, you know, we're the political pundit class of legacy, right? And a lot of the content right now in the actual political class is this like spin your wheels and try and figure out what these scenarios are, which is why I wanted to talk about. It sort of inspired me to come up with the idea for this episode today, which is like in August, what would the next best thing be then? Right? Like let's assume, you know, like let's start at a baseline. August happens, Grief gets banned. Do they ban anything else? Like let's just go in a fantasy world. Phil, what do you want to see banned? Like, what's your fantasy list of cards, you know, that you think reasonably will be banned, and we can work from there, I think.
That'll reasonably ban? Do you want me to think what they'll reasonably do?
Reasonable. Like, let's not like, oh, yeah, like, they're going to bring back Mana Drain or something. Like, that's not, like, you know, let's stay in the 70% range, I would say.
I think what they're going to do is just ban Grief. What I think they should do is probably get rid of Grief and Bowmaster.
Mm-hmm.
And if what I want them to do is get rid of Grief and Bowmaster and Urza Saga and Ancient Tomb and Days.
And unban Sensei's Dividing Top, of course.
I assume that's not reasonable.
Yeah.
Although I do think that like any of these points along the way, you know, there's, I don't want to get into like symptoms and diseases, but at any point along the way, I think like there's the argument that Days can go, and that might give a little bit of reprieve to everything else. Because when a card that is oppressing the format goes, then I imagine that the effect of that would be a bunch of other stuff is lifted. So,
let's live in that world for like 10 minutes, Phil.
Which
they
one?
ban Grief. Okay. They ban Days.
Yeah.
Where do we go from there?
I think
what does the legacy of landscape look if there's a Days ban with Grief?
I think if Days wasn't in the format, I think the playable legacy card pool expands by such a volume that it's like not even possible to predict.
Yeah.
Because
I agree. I think we either live in that world or in a world where our worst fears are realized and combo takes over. It's literally one or the other for me. Like I think I'm still like very shaky on do we Days ban, and then it unleashes like this horde of storm decks that like everyone has to deal with, and that is miserable, or does it just free up the format and everyone and like the storm decks are still easy to beat, you know, with Flusterstorm and whatnot. There's plenty of answers still, right?
There's plenty of answers,
and of course there are. But you know, like you have to at least live in that possibility where like, oh no, like no, like the next top 8 is like 5 storm decks, right?
The way that I would so the way that you say that and the way that I would like steer the lens towards is when it's like, will combo just take over if we do if we do a Days ban? And that is putting Days through the lens of something that is helping and protecting the format from degeneracy, as opposed to compressing and being the degenerate part of the
I mean, this is the you know, what do they call that? The railroad guy's dilemma,
right? So
you know,
I would argue that Days is not creating anything healthy, in that it is oppressing.
Prisoner's dilemma.
It's oppressing the format in ways that aren't generating interesting gameplay or interesting deck building, because it is just ostracizing a whole swath of cards that might be playable if you were ever reasonably allowed to considerably tap out. Right.
Correct.
But like because the mere like baseline of tapping out is something that you're just not allowed to do reasonably against the majority of the best decks. I mean, the best shell forever, right? If you're on your deck building calculations are like, okay, what can I reasonably play that I theoretically never have to tap out? Now, of course, there'll be positions where you tap out, but like if you're building your deck in ways where you're like, I need to be lower so that when I tap out, it's not crazy, because the heavier you tap out, the more punishing days is, right? So you immediately, we've talked about this a million times, but I think that like as like grief is just a miserable play pattern and leads to games that are unfun. But I don't think grief is necessarily like the way that grief has to change, like charges your deck building, is you just need redundancy, right? Because if you assume that your starting hands are always going to be 5 cards or below, then you just need your cards to do the same thing.
Well, this is the issue with grief, Phil, is in a world with grief and days, right? The redundancy cards exist at a higher mana cost, right? So if you want to get to that redundancy phase of the game, right, like where you're playing, Dak Faden, or you're on Punishing Jund or something like that, right? Like all of those engines are in that 3-drop space, 4-drop space. You want to play a card that gets you back the momentum you lost. Play Miskin Boo, right? No, it gets dazed, right? So maybe, and I'm going off of what you're saying here, is that maybe if we get rid of days, right, then you expand over 50% of the cards that are now playable, right? And I'm not saying, hey, we need to live in a world where like everyone's playing the One Ring and everyone's playing Minskin Boo and 3-drop Planeswalkers and stuff like that. But I'm saying it opens up a slightly longer game and allows you to play cards that could recoup those expenses. Do I want to live in a world where they justify they justify keeping grief by banning days? No, that's not where I want to live. But it's like I said, this is the first part of our thought experiment.
Yeah, I think that like you could probably categorize cards that I'd be more interested in banning are the ones that their existence implies some amount of overhaul in deck building that constrains the format as opposed to enables it, right?
Yeah.
So in ways that Grief and Daze and Bowmaster in particular are these cards that there are certain cards that you're like, these cards are just flat stone unplayable as long as these kinds of cards exist in the format, right? So unless you are voluntarily handicapping yourself, knowing that I am going to lose to this card straight up, then I will play these things. So if you're looking to be competitive, you just have to immediately get rid of all that stuff. So, Bowmaster, anything that's an X1 that doesn't give you value immediately or isn't part of some kind of combo or doesn't have some kind of self-built-in protection of some kind, but then also is like, and there's a difference between those kinds of cards and removal spells, right? There's a difference between something that, like, okay, Bowmasters exists, therefore going down a card plus a threat that's going to kill me is too powerful for me to be able to play this X1. But nobody was going, well, I can't play this X1 because Bolt exists, right?
Yeah.
Because the Bolt is an exchange, but it's not the thing that's also then killing me, and then also, it's not cutting.
It's like 3 cards. Yeah.
It's not a removal spell that then also wins the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same way, you're like, okay, well, I can't play, it's really hard to play A plus B combo if Grief exists and just gets to strip one part of the combo, and then now I'm flummoxing around until I can try and put that together again, right? Like, and in that same suite, it's like the prime example. And don't get me wrong, I'm not like weeping for show and tell, but it's really hard for an A plus B style deck like show and tell to exist when you're just going to get double griefed all the time, on most games. And then for things like Urza Saga, I think that Urza Saga is the kind of gameplay where it unilaterally being so strong while being like, it's the type of card that it's not necessarily stopping you from doing anything else, but when right now there's these power outliers between Beanstalk and, I would probably put Beanstalk on that list too, because it's causing there's not really a reasonable control deck anymore, because the Beanstalk control decks are just, a Days Wasteland shell with Beanstalk because it's cheap. And all of the cards that you'd play with it actually are better in Days Wasteland shells, a la like Murktide and shit, than they are in a control shell. But I think something like Urza Saga makes it so that you're just so, you can play Urza Saga in combo, in control, in any kind of tempo if you wanted to. Like one deck that I imagine we'll start to see pop up, like as people just like experiment and explore, which we'll talk about as like what will the world look like without grief. Like I expect. Do you remember old Sagavon decks?
Of course, yeah.
You remember those, right? Yeah, where it's like every treasure would just also pump your constructs, and that was just the deck. Mm-hmm. Well, Tamiyo makes a treasure, or not a treasure, a clue every time it attacks, right? Which is very similar to what Ragavan did, except it's also blue. And so I imagine that we would see Tamiyo Urza Saga decks, where Tamiyo is just making anthems every turn for your constructs, and you can just go, play your Tamiyo on one, and then start going to town the same way that you did with Ragavan. And like literally take that shell and instead of Ragavan, put in Tamiyos, and then you effectively have what is close to the same thing. Now, granted, it's not mana. Mana and clues are obviously different, but like it's also there's it can flip into a planeswalker and do all that stuff. So I imagine that like that's the space we go into. It's to summarize what I'm saying, so I can throw the ball back to you. Is once grief goes, I think we just immediately fall back onto the other power outliers that we've talked about that are just going to remain the power outliers until they also get rid of those. And those are Urza Saga, Bowmasters, and Beanstalk. And it's just going to be very, like, Grief will go, and then I don't think much of the format changes. Because I think Grief goes, and then you just get to slot Bowmaster back into that spot. But now nobody's getting grieved, right? So, like, maybe the space opens up a little bit, and then Bowmaster will just pick off everything that people are trying to do with the space around not having to get double griefed. And then we're just going to see these baseline, Dothy Voidwalker, Orcish Bowmaster style decks as like these overpowered black shells just be the best thing going on. And then now they also have Psychic Frog, right?
Yeah.
So
I guess what that kind of brings me to, Phil, is like grief obviously is a problem, but is grief the thing that is stifling like deck creativity, like deck diversity, right? It's not. I argue it's Bowmasters that's doing that, because the number one thing you need to do to be competitive in Magic the Gathering is draw extra cards or manipulate your draw steps somehow, right? And I think that is why the most likely ban, in my opinion, the most likely ban would be Orcs and Grief. So let's talk about what that reality looks like.
Yeah, I am in favor of banning more than one thing. So I would be more in favor of a Grief plus Bowmaster ban, because if there's the pattern of like they ban one card and then that just opens up 4 slots for like the next best thing that's also probably a problem. And so if they don't go the one step further to be like, okay, what goes into that slot? If there's a very clearly obvious thing that goes into that open 4 slots, then I feel like the problem is not going to be solved, because the best deck will just adopt. It's the Delver problem, right? It just adopts whatever the next best thing is. In the broken shell, that's the disease. And then the disease just causes that symptom to, again, be a problem. And then we run into the same problem again. So I'm more in favor of they're taking an additional 2 months here. And if the additional 2 months that they're doing isn't for some kind of like legitimate overhaul of getting rid of these like very clear power outliers that are just making it so that the format is the most, these like top 15 cards plus the free spells, then we're just going to run into the exact same problem in the fall, where we're going to be like, okay, we would really like a shakeup because we're running into the same, it's just going to be the same environment again. And I don't know if anybody remembers, I know that like the Grief decks have been sort of eating at each other, and so Bowmaster's like sort of fallen out a little bit because it's not good against opposing Riscaminator shells. But there was like a good X number of months where everybody was like, my God, Bowmaster on Bowmaster on Bowmaster on Bowmaster is just so uninteresting every single game, right? That's all the format was for like months after it came out. And nobody was enjoying that. I mean, not that I saw anybody was enjoying that. Like there was talking, like literally they were like, in the ban announcement, they were like, we're keeping an eye on Orcish Bowmaster. Like it was popular, it was prevalent enough that like WotC commented on it. So like if they get rid of Grief, which is right now just got the limelight of being the thing that nobody's enjoying, then we just go right back to Bowmaster on Bowmaster shenanigans, and then we're right back in a place that we already were, that we know we can avoid. So I'm hoping in this next 2 months, when they're like, okay, what's the problem? Grief's a problem. We also know the data that we had before this, that Bowmaster was causing a bunch of problems, being ubiquitous everywhere, which is the same problem Deathray Shaman was. It's like, okay, let's actually do some overhaul, because if we're going to keep adding all of this stuff and make it so that these new cards are just going to be power creeping everything else out, let's actually solve some problems as close as we can without changing the quote-unquote identity of the format, whatever.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because, spoiler alert for anybody watching now, our bonus content this week is going to be about ABC deck building. So this kind of all, like, it'll be like your 15-minute guide to ABC deck building. And the thing about this episode is, like, you have to determine from kind of those tenets, like, what the next best thing to do is, right? So if you're talking about like, okay, they ban Bowmasters, they ban Grief, right? So we look at the format and you think about what the format looked like in, this time like last year, let's say 4 months before this, last year, right? Before Lord of the Rings came out, right? And you saw Cephalid Breakfast, which, I mean, they might. I'm giving them a lot of grace here. They might pre-ban Nadu, just seeing as how freaking ridiculous it is in modern, right? And just be like, we already know. Like they did that in standard once. They were like, if we're gonna ban this, but we're also gonna ban this like card for red deck wins because we just know that that's the obvious go-to. Everyone will go to like so. The BNR team has the like cognition to be like, hey, here is a problem. Here is the next obvious step that players will take. Easy solve that they'll just like lazily dive into this deck. And if we could see something like, okay, if we want to, like you want to find out what the legacy power level thing to do is, right? As soon as a ban restricted announcement comes up, you have an idea, right? What's the most powerful thing that I can be doing in this format, right? And you build that deck, but then you also want to be thinking about like, okay, well, what are other people going to be doing, and how do I destroy that, right? And to their credit, Riscaminator players are on that plan. They were like, okay, the most powerful thing to be doing is playing Riscaminator, so I'll play Dothy Voidwalker in my Riscaminator deck, and there you go, right? So I think that this part of the thought experiment is interesting because we get to say, okay, right, tomorrow, August, whatever, they ban Bowmasters and they ban Grief. Am I going back to like Blue Red Delver or like Teamer Delver or whatever, assuming that like Daze is still the thing you want to be doing, right? You could do that. You could play Cephalid Breakfast now that X ones are live, and Nadu exists, so you could just do like almost its own deck all by itself, which I think will be quickly become a problem as well. So I think like if you own Nadu's, that's gonna be your chance to like get in your reps.
So just quick jump on Nadu. What I like everybody like there for modern at least there was like the dump off of Nadu's value after the Pro Tour because everybody's just assuming that Nadu's going to get banned. And you actually know what I think the fix is going to be, what they're actually going to do instead of banning Nadu? I think they're going to errata the equipment rules.
What does that mean?
Because right now the equipment rules is with Shuko is that you can equip to a creature that's already equipped.
Yeah.
And I think they're gonna. I think rather than doing this ban,
do you think that's going to be the fix? Because having two creatures just gets around that.
I think they're going to do that first rather than ban the thing out of the way. I think rather than actually rather than like do the smart thing and just like cut the cancer or cut the mistake, I think they're gonna do what they did to the Cascade rules with Valky, right?
Can't imagine what they did?
Morrow. Do you remember that?
Okay,
with the MDFCs?
Yeah, I do remember that.
With the MDFCs, I think they're gonna do the same thing there.
I think you would be hard pressed for Morrow to say yes to a fix, like a literal like errata on.
They did that to Cascade. They did it to Cascade. Yeah, so if they're taking an additional 2 months rather than just banning Grief now, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not just delaying what was obvious and inevitable that everybody wanted and was clear to them because their legacy expert told them. So why would they have any reason to believe anything less than what the legacy expert and literally the entire community, including TOs, are now telling them? So I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not just clowns, that they're actually like, we're trying to find a more measured approach rather than doing multiple ban announcements multiple months apart. Like only a couple months apart and changing the format simultaneously each time, that they're just going to be like, we're taking additional time to look at, we know Grief is going to go and we're looking at what we're talking about right now, what is the format likely to look like after Grief goes, and we expect it to be similar to the Bowmaster on Bowmaster shenanigans that nobody else liked back when we were talking about Bowmaster being on the chopping block, and looking at that data from before and seeing if Grief isn't around, will it just be that again? And so that they're actually taking multiple steps, which is why I think this delay isn't them just being assholes. I think the delay is because they're going to take a more, like a heavier-handed approach and ban multiple cards as opposed to just a single card, right?
Yeah. I mean, that is my hope, is that they're using the data a little more effectively to give us something a little more robust than just like, yeah, we saw you guys don't like grief. We heard you yell at us. Now we're gonna just take that and do it, right? I'd like to see them be like, we're gonna take measured but very appropriate steps to fix this format. And maybe they on top of that announce like, hey, we've reached out to some other experts about the format. We're not going to have a panel, but we do want to get a litmus test from more than just like the one guy in the room that plays Legacy, right? That would be my ideal situation, is that they make like substantive bans and they say we're working to fix the problem, because there's obviously a problem.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me too, when like the longer that we are trying to flesh out what the format looks like post grief, it's also making me think that the most recent ban announcement that they made of anything that introduces stickers or attractions into the game, which was really just a nod to Sticker Goblin, right?
Yeah.
And the complexities of that, and the complexities of doing all of the work on Moto for one card, essentially one card, because anybody else who was playing any of the other attractions or stickers was doing it for gimmicks, not for competitive viability. Where Sticker Goblin was actually a competitively viable thing, right? The Goblins deck was just the best Stompy deck. So if we look at what the format looks like without grief, I actually think that there's also going to be a big surge in initiative. And I don't know if that's also all that exciting for anybody. I mean, granted, there's clear bias here. Like, I fucking hate that mechanic more than anything. But I also don't know if, like, is that something that people enjoyed?
Is it too much for them to just ban that too? Right.
Well, I guess going back to when you said, I had forgotten that that initiative is something that is still reasonable, because every time an initiative creature touches play, I just scoop. So like I play against it a lot less than I used to, because I just don't engage with that experience at all anymore. Because the second, like, nobody gets to take out their initiative token against me, right? I'm scooping that before we even get to that point of gameplay. Yeah.
You're like, you cast Show and Tell, you put Grizzlebrand in play, you win.
Yeah, and even then, it's like, maybe I'll sit through a Grizzlebrand, even though the game's effectively over. Initiative, I'm like, we're not taking the time to do all of this nonsense to figure out a thing that is just like going to win the game by itself anyway, that I can't touch and interact with at all. So, but I know that, like, at least from what initiative players have told us, and like other Stompy players have told us, is that initiative has fallen off because it's really bad against grief, because they just go grief your initiative creature, and then reanimate your initiative creature, and the game ends because you can't beat the initiative.
Yeah,
so
sucks to suck.
Right. So you can't play like. So if that's the case, if grief going means that initiative also surges back, then I'd be like, okay, then I think you got to look at grief, you got to look at Bowmaster, and you have to look at initiative as a fucking mechanic.
Yeah. Well, that's that like looking like that's that 4D chess move for design, is like looking to the next step. What will, like, if you can create what does a healthy metagame look like, right? And it's, to me, there is no clear, like, this is the deck that you have to play, right? Whereas like it used to be, and my Magic Boomer is coming out. It used to be like you'd play in an event, you'd run into some number of Delver decks, you'd run into some number of like Golgari things that, like some number of like people playing like Innocent Blood, to stop those decks. You'd run into a couple people playing Maverick, right? And the metagame was diverse enough that, like, you couldn't just be like, every deck had another deck that ate it, and I think that's where I'd like to be personally, is like to be in a spot where, like, there's a rock, paper, scissors to this format, right? Like, if Maverick beats Delver, Combo beats Maverick, and Delver beats Combo, right? Like something in that realm.
And it would be nice if within that there is some amount of interplay, that it's not just all matchup dependent.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I would personally want to be. And then so let's go out on a limb one step further with this thought experiment.
Right before we jump in, that I also want to say that from a design standpoint, I also think that there should be, like, I don't think competitive viability or like the comfort of something should be the same across the board. And by that I mean, I don't think the players who are trying to play Maverick versus the players that are trying to play combo should both be incentivized and quote, quote, protected the same way. I think it should be more difficult for the combo player because the combo player is trying to not interact with you and end the game immediately. Like, I think the degenerate decks versus the fair decks and the way that we think about those things, I think you should be incentivizing and protecting the fair decks more because those are those are the archetypes and the gameplay that you are trying to actually like activate in your design space. Where you know what I mean? Like, when you're designing a game, you're not thinking, I want my players to not interact with each other, and I want them to only care about a subsection of the thousands and thousands of cards that we care about, and I want the games to end as fast as possible. Like, I can't imagine that that's the process that you want from a designer. So I think, like, we should make it difficult for the combo players.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny. We were talking about politics before, and what you're saying, Phil, is that you don't want both sidesism.
Yes, I don't want both sidesism.
Right? You don't want the same amount of coverage for the bad actors of the format, right? That you get for
just to qualify before you all get in the comments and spike us. Like, get in the comments, do your thing, but like this is not a comment on like the people who play initiative and the people who play combo and like that I don't like those people. I don't like those archetypes and the incentivizing and enabling of those archetypes to be easier to do.
Yeah, I like you. I just don't like what you do.
Right. A lot of people don't like that I cast Terminus against them. They're not like, oh, man, Phil sucks. They're like, the fact that Phil is always casting Terminus against my deck that cares about Terminus sucks.
It's weirdly endearing, actually. Well, it's a funny thing, because, here I am trying to figure out what my next move is as far as decks are concerned. And I could, in the world that happens where Bowmasters and Grief goes, I'm already off Bowmasters in my Beans deck, right? Like I'm playing 2. I could move to 0 and feel like just as good about it. I'm siding them out so often that like, even in a situation where like I get somebody, there are a couple games where like, woo, you like slam one because someone's not respecting it and you get them, fine, and they scoop almost immediately online. But so in that world, I'm trying to figure out: do I want to stay with this power outlier of Beanstalk? Do I want to move on to something else, or is there something else undiscovered that we can brew up? Right? Now that I have access to every card on Magic Online, right? Like,
Jack, that is exactly why. Like, if there is something undiscovered that we could brew up, that's like the perfect encapsulation of why. Every time a band announcement comes around, I'm always like, please just put days on it.
Yeah.
Like
the whole format would open up.
That's the whole sentiment of like these power outliers and like there's power outliers, there's format oppressors, and it's like if you go after a format oppressor, that like quintessentially sums up: is there something undiscovered that we could find and play that would be exciting? And it's like not as long as there's a power oppressor, a format oppressor keeping it out at bay. Because if you're doing it after FNM and hoping that you just don't run into a format oppressor, right? Yeah. So you can actually do the thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a good spot to call it. This was actually a pretty interesting conversation. I wasn't sure how it was going to go, but
this is also one like this is actually a get in the comments type episode. Like,
please get in the comments.
This is also this isn't like there's pretty transparent here between now and when the ban happens. There's not going to be a lot of like shifting around of the format. Like, it's going to be a lot of speculation as to like what this ban announcement is going to look like between now and when the ban announcement happens. So like, we are like, obviously Zach and I both have our like natural biases for the decks that we like to play. Hop in the comments, tell us what you think the ban list is actually going to look like, because then we'll probably actually take a lot of that feedback and use it for an episode.
Yeah, not only that, but like, Phil, if we've learned one thing from and to a point, have we learned that one thing, is that they listen to the people who talk in the format, right? Like, we could have an effect on the ban list somehow, right? Like, if we're out here talking about it, thinking about it, and creating a conversation about that, that's something that Wizards is actively looking at. So maybe we can get something like a days ban or something like that to happen, just off of data that they're collecting right now in this lame duck period of the format.
Yeah, maybe
So-
maybe we get we'll get some in regards to the days argument. We'll find the people who are the prominent pro dazers who are like looking at days through the lens as a protective element of the format as opposed to an oppressive element of the format, and we can go back and we can have that little debate where I'm very clearly on it's an oppressive element, but if we can get some clips of people who are like, no, here's why it's a protective element, the same way that people look at Force of Will and Wasteland as, then that'd be that maybe there's something interesting there to go back and forth with that people would enjoy watching.
Yeah. Well, with that said, I want to quickly thank everybody who has joined us. We had 2 new people join us this week. Thank you to Chris and hold on, I got this. Thank you to Raphael, and thank you to Conrad for all joining us at the Durdle Maniac level to get their ad-free content and the bonus episodes. Look at Brando; he needs these treats that we're buying him to stay on the podcast. So,
Brando won't join us on the podcast without treats, so we got to.
He doesn't join us on the podcast without treats. So if you want to see more Brando, it's a perfect time to join us on Patreon or Spotify or YouTube. Each of those will get you that ad-free tier and get you the bonus content that we do weekly as well now. So again, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to all our supporters for supporting us. And we will catch you probably a little later this week. Have a good one. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.